Welcome to a year of courageous conversations in which together we explore how to foster greater inclusion and belonging in our communities. I'm Claire Nelson, and because it's my first time up here this season, I'm just going to say a couple words about who I am. I'm maybe better known around these parts as David and Carol Nelson's daughter, right there. But I also spent my first 2 decades of this life in this community, and now I live in New Orleans, and I lead urban consulate programs in Detroit and Philadelphia and Cincinnati to bring people together and share ideas for better communities. I've been thinking a lot about where I got the bug for this work, and it was really right here in Barrington. I had a wonderful social studies teacher named Jean Capellas who introduced me to Amnesty International when I was a teenager, which got me really interested in human rights work. And my father's commitment to civic engagement and public service has always been an inspiration. And my mother, I don't know if you remember, Mom, but in my high school yearbook, the message she published when I graduated said, "Always fight for a just cause," which I always appreciate. It was also in here in Barrington I had my first failures trying to do just that. I remember after the Rodney King riots, I put up posters around the high school that said something like, "Why aren't we talking about this?" I was always a little frustrated with my fellow students that they weren't more socially engaged, but you know, at that age, I think we were supposed to be having fun. Then I started a group called PEACE, which was not such a great acronym for Political Education and Awareness of Current Events. And let's just say, not a lot of people showed up, and it was my first big flop. So ever since, I never take for granted rooms like this of people eager to talk and listen and learn together. And I really can't tell you how much it means to me to be working with Zena and Jess this year to have the opportunity to do that back here in my hometown. So thank you. I'm learning a lot. Along with Jessica Green, Zena Jacques, and our Courageous Conversations team, we want to thank you for joining us tonight. Who knew a year ago when we planned tonight's topic, challenging separation, we would also be having a national conversation about social distancing? My goodness, but thank you for bravely sharing space together this evening. It's a good opportunity for all of us to practice our air kisses and elbow bumps for the weeks and months to come. I want to say a special thanks to those who've joined us on this journey since September. If you're new tonight or if you missed any of our previous sessions on fear and courage, bias and curiosity, mindfulness and listening, privilege and prejudice, please visit our website at courageousconversations.us or us for recaps and videos. And on that topic, I want to take a moment to thank Tamara Table. Did I say that right? How do you say it? Where? Tabell. I always write your name. I haven't said it much. Tamara, Linda Barrett, Delack Video for their beautiful documentation of this series. They do an amazing job capturing our events each month, and it's really far more work than it may appear, so thank you all. And please use the website because there's a lot of effort put into documenting so we can read afterwards. Speaking of video, thank you for silencing your phones so we can practice our grounding virtues of being present with one another. And to create space for honest sharing, we ask that as individuals in the room share openly during our breakout dialogues. We treat this information as sacred and let it remain with you upon leaving. Thank you. Tonight we also have many fellows who are serving as facilitators at tables. Can you raise your hands? Excellent. In some cases, multiple fellows at tables. Thank you. Please give them don't give them a rough time. Follow their lead. And we know we've heard a lot this year that there's never enough time for talking. We're going to try to do a better job of that tonight, our 2 hours together. But please keep these conversations going with friends and family and neighbors, even strangers after you leave. Producing this series is a team effort, so our deepest thanks to Barrington's White House, Barrington Area Library, Be Strong Together, Barrington Area Community Foundation, BMO Wealth Management, Sue and Rich Padula, Kim Duchessois, and Jessica and Dominic Green for making this program possible. Thank you. One of the reasons Jess passed the torch to me to open tonight, giving her a little break, but also because this topic's very close to my heart. It's actually more than that, it's kind of an obsession. There are lots of ways that we are separated, but personally, I'm very interested in how we as humans share space with one another, whether in a room like tonight or in neighborhoods or even across cities and regions, and how we do that can either help us or exacerbate the already difficult but essential work we are called to do to share this beautiful country and planet together and make collective decisions about our future. For me, it's always been kind of a chicken or the egg question. Some say we need to talk and listen to one another, and once we get more comfortable and familiar with diversity and we build trust with one another, we'll more naturally live and work together. That makes sense. In my life experience, it's often been kind of the flip of that, which is that when I have physically put myself in different environments, I've learned a lot. It's revealed a lot to me that I would have never imagined or understood otherwise. And when I think about my work and my life, living and working in diverse communities has been the greatest gift of my life. So with that, I'm very excited to welcome tonight's guest presenter, Kendra Freeman, from the Metropolitan Planning Council. Since 1934, the Metropolitan Planning Council has been dedicated to shaping a more equitable, sustainable, and prosperous Greater Chicago region. And as an independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan organization, they serve both communities and residents. In 2017, when their groundbreaking Cost of Segregation report came out, I wasn't here in the Chicagoland region, but I remember exactly because I was sitting when it came out, when it was released, and I gasped. And I emailed it to a lot of my friends and colleagues. This report did something that many others had not, which was to quantify the negative effects of spatial separation for not just those who are most harmed, but for everyone. And for that, it's been really groundbreaking work, and I'm really excited to have her here tonight to share it. Kendra Freeman is Director of Community Development and Engagement, where she oversees housing policy and equitable transit-oriented development programs and guides the organization's approach to community engagement in research, policy advocacy, and technical assistance. She holds a master's degree in public administration from DePaul University, has held leadership positions in the private and nonprofit sectors. She's also a licensed real estate broker. She serves as a co-chair of Elevated Chicago, which is really interesting if you want to look that up, and as an advisor to the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Initiative Greater Chicago, which I know some people in this room are a part. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our Courageous Conversations co-host and lead pastor of Barrington's Community Church, Dr. Reverend Zena Jock, and then we'll welcome Kendra Freeman out. Thanks.
What do you think of when I say the word immersion? I'm Baptist, so that could mean water, but I'm not talking about that. Immersion. Often people will think about those vacations where you decided to eschew the well-worn paths and to find yourself in the midst of an experience where you were part of the locals. You might have eaten things you weren't sure you would ever have eaten again. First time I held a goat leg in my hand. Is sheep's what?
A sheep's eye.
A sheep's eye? Yes. Immersion. A silkworm. So to eat? Whoa. But something happens when you travel and you put yourself in a place where everything that you know is gone. And you have to learn the routes. You're not in power. You don't know the familiar paths. You find yourself relying on those around you. But when you get home, your stories are way better than the people on the take your pick. Right? That immersion where you give up some power and take on some learning and are transformed. Or here in town, the immersion experience is that of the Chinese immersion program, We have 160 kids, K3, who are in an immersion program, and if they stay through their 12th grade year, they will be surrounded by culture and language and tradition. They will have had an immersive experience that the 220 website says, don't come unless you're committed to the journey. Don't come unless you're willing to be academically challenged. Don't come unless you're willing to not go to your neighborhood school and find yourself, this is to the parents, in circumstances that are not familiar. It doesn't say this, but as I read that immersive experience, it was take a risk and be better. That kind of immersion is good for us. But we won't do it in our everyday lives. We rarely find ourselves willing, if we're not on vacation or in the Chinese program, to move into a place where we don't speak the language, where we don't know the routes, particularly escape routes, where we don't understand the culture, and where we can't gin up our power to make something happen, where the rules are not the ones we set, and we are at the mercy of a system we didn't create and don't know. It's fine on vacation or in the Chinese program, but we obey barriers and walls and boundaries because we don't take our power with us in those places where we are the other. I'll never forget one of my congregants, we were going to see Wicked. And one of my congregants said to me, come ride with me. And I'm like, oh, let's take the train. God as my witness, this woman born and raised in Barrington said, you can't control who you sit next to on the metro. If you get on in Barrington, yeah, you do. Yeah, I mean, come on. Yeah, you do. So what is it, beloved, that keeps us unwilling to cross those barriers, to find the experiences in our everyday life where we are immersed, where we are learning about the other? But even more to the point tonight, what's the cost? What's the cost when we find it too frightening to immerse ourselves where we are not in power? What's the cost? We're going to learn tonight what that cost is. But here's my request. I am willing to bet that each of us will have a stereotype upturned tonight. And my hope, actually my prayer, is that when that moment hits you, that moment that went, really? That you will be willing to immerse yourself in learning more about that thing, so that when we leave here tonight, we will be ready, if not to immerse ourselves in an entirely different culture, to immerse ourselves in the search for facts. Robin DiAngelo said, if you want to learn something, you Google. She said the shit out of it. I'll try not to say that. But, oh, and it's on tape. Something you will hear tonight will trouble you, will even disturb you because you didn't know it and you now know the cost. And the challenge is, will you file it away? Or is this experience of immersion, not on vacation or in the Chinese program, enough of a call to go further? I hope so. Kendra, come challenge us.
Thank you for that powerful introduction and framing. I feel like, can I take you on my road shows whenever I have to do these presentations? I love that. So I'm Kendra, everyone. I just wanted to share a couple of things that are not in my bio. I am a native Chicagoan, grew up on the southeast side of Chicago. I currently live in the south suburbs. so it'll be an interesting drive home for me tonight. And I spent a lot of time, thankfully crediting my mom and my grandmother on public transportation as a kid, and went all over the place. Lincoln Park, the North Suburbs, the Botanic Garden, Brookfield Zoo. And a lot of that time was with my nose kind of pressed to the glass, like watching neighborhoods change. And I really credit that to the path that I took, working at the community level, working in affordable housing, and now working at the policy level, hopefully making neighborhoods stronger and making our region more equitable. So thank you, all of you, for welcoming me tonight to Barrington to share this conversation with you. It's a really important conversation that we need to be having all over the region, not just in urban spaces. So if I can figure out the technology, we're going to start with a short video. Okay, great. So we're going to take a few minutes just to debrief that. So if you turn to a person on your left or your right at your table, do pairs, find a pair, find a partner. We're going to take 5 minutes. And choose a question that you'd like to respond to. So the questions are, what did you learn? What surprised you from the video? What challenged you? Or what was new? Maybe something you heard for the first time. So paired sharing, 5 minutes total. So each person can talk for about 2 minutes. So make sure each person has a chance to share. So remember, just in twos, because we don't have a lot of time. Go. Just wanted to give some kind of foundation for some of the things we're going to be talking about in the presentation. We can't cram like 50 years of housing policy into like a 30-minute session. But hopefully this was a bit of a lighthearted way to really get you thinking about structural racism, really is what it is. And I talk about that a lot, and you'll hear me talk about it later. And this is really the reason why. And part of the solution that we're setting forward as an organization is, how do we begin to dismantle and undo structural racism? We may change our behaviors, we may change our attitudes towards things, but if we don't kind of stop and interrogate, like, what are the practices, what are the policies, what are the underlying things that hold inequities in place, no matter how much we change our behaviors, no matter how much we change our attitudes, we're still going to have the same type of results. So, and this is in part what the cost of segregation study is talking about. So before we jump into the study and the findings, I did want to share a redlining map, which, brings things to life. This is actually a redlining map of the Chicago region. So does my clicker work? So around here is actually the county border, so you can kind of see that, it also includes some of the North Shore. But this is a typical redlining map. It was done in the 1940s by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And again, it was a process of how do we identify neighborhoods of where we want to loan homes, make home loans to, and how do we categorize them? So the green on the map were considered the best neighborhoods. So you see some green up towards the northern area of the map. I don't know if you can see the colors very well, but there's like a little purple kind of lilac area, and those neighborhoods were classified as still desirable. So maybe not as good as the green areas, but they're still okay. You can still move there. The yellow areas were declining, so these are places on the decline you want to avoid. And then the red areas, they were literally called hazardous. And these were very much designed, and you can even still see if you looked at a map of Chicago and the Chicago region now, these still follow kind of traditional lines of what we see of segregation in the city, with most black and brown people in the south and west sides, and then the majority of white people in the north sides and the suburban areas. I think what's interesting, as we're in the suburban areas now, you don't see colors, you see a lot of grayed out areas. In the grayed out areas, particularly in the northern and the western suburbs, actually they're grayed out because there was not enough of a significant either low-income population or minority population to even color them. So these areas, for the most part, are all white and mostly affluent areas. So just to bring that into some context for our conversation today. So I wanted to start with a little bit more ground setting because I'm going to talk about equity a lot, so to make sure we're kind of coming into this with the same definition of equity. So when I talk about equity, I'm referring to the systematic fair treatment of all people that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. Simple, right? I'm also going to talk a lot about racial equity. And so when I talk about racial equity, it's really focusing on like how do we begin to close the gap so that race is no longer a predictor of success. And how can we improve outcomes? We center the people who are kind of worse off because we start from the premise that if we center those who are worse off, we're ultimately going to improve conditions for everyone. And we think of racial equity as both an outcome and a process. So how you do it, there's an equity framework for that, and then it also has to be something you measure at the end. And I think of this is also in some concepts this kind of centering people who are worse off to make it better for the whole is also part of a concept called targeted universalism. And a good example of that is if you think about the 70s, when disability advocates really came together to challenge and institute the ADA. So one of the big things was people who were in wheelchairs couldn't get off the sidewalks because there were no curb cuts. So this started a whole movement of improving mobility and accessibility for people, specifically who have mobility challenges. But we all benefit from those. If you've ever pulled a suitcase down the street or pushed a baby stroller, we've all benefited from those things. So that's maybe a good reference to think about it that way. So a little bit about the cost of segregation study. So we started the study in, I guess, technically 2015. It's a multi-year study. It grew out of MPC's housing policy work. So we typically do a lot of work around housing policy. We were working with the city and others on inclusionary housing policies. And one of the things that we kept hearing, because the way at least the city of Chicago's inclusionary housing policy works is whenever the city has like a benefit, so if they're giving land for $1 or if you get a zoning change or something like that, it kicks in a requirement to do affordable housing as part of your development. So we would hear often from developers like, wow, that costs a lot of money to build those. And typically it's like 10%, which is pretty low. So 200 units, you're doing 20 affordable. And affordable is subjective. There are different levels of affordability. So we would just hear, this is it costs too much money. And we started posing the question, well, have we stopped to think of what it costs, us to continue to do things the way we do them? One of the things that we were seeing was just a pattern of where affordable housing was being cited. So developers would get these benefits instead of some of them would do on-site affordability, but most times they would not, and they would just pay into a pot that supports affordable housing. But then the pot of affordable housing money would support affordable housing, but the majority of that housing would go in certain neighborhoods. So predominantly Latino or African American neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods, yes, definitely needed affordable housing there. But when you congregate like all the affordable housing in one area, you're limiting people's choices, you're limiting the opportunities for moderate and low-income people to live in other types of neighborhoods. So we were thinking, like, what if we tried to montify, to begin to, what is the cost of what we're doing right now? There's got to be a cost to this, because everybody wants to talk about the cost of a solution. The other goal of this work was really to begin to change the way that we talk about segregation. So typically when we talk about segregation, we typically talk about it in terms of what are the negatives to poor communities of color. And that's only half the story. When we don't talk about it from a broader perspective, then we kind of let a whole lot of people off the hook. Chatham on the south side of Chicago is just as segregated as Barrington. It's just in very different ways. So how are we talking about both sides of the equation, and how are we understanding how both sides affect all of us and our ability to thrive and prosper as a region? So we had two research questions that we tried to attack, and I guess I could say this study was 2 phases, but it was really multiple phases. The first one is really, what is it costing us to live so separately by income and by race? And the second one is, what do we do about it? Like, now that we know what it's costing us, what can we do to change our trajectory? So I'll quickly just walk through our process. Again, we started the research process in 2015. In March of 2017, we actually came out with the first report, The Cost of Segregation, which we'll talk about the findings in a minute. And then we spent about a year or so just really thinking about, like, how do we get to some low-hanging fruit as far as policy recommendations that we can make and pursue over the next 2 to 5 years to really begin to see a difference. And that roadmap, which is a green handout on your table, came out in 2018, and we're in phase 3. We're still trying to push for implementation of a lot of those recommendations. So what is segregation costing us? The million-dollar question. Before I get into the findings, I just want to give a little bit of context on the study so it makes sense. So we partnered with the Urban Institute, which is a large research institute situated in DC. And we measured 3 types of segregation. We measured black and white segregation, we measured Latino and white segregation, and we measured economic segregation. And what Urban did was they looked at the 100 of the largest metropolitan areas in order to crunch those numbers and come up with a median point for how segregated we are. So when we think about the study, we're not saying, what if Chicago went from our current level of segregation to 0? We're just saying, what if we went from our current level of segregation to a median point? What could that look like in our city? What is it costing us? I also say that this study is not a causation study, so it's not a cause and effect study, but it's a correlation. What we learned by looking at the broader picture is the regions and metropolitan areas that have lower levels of segregation, they perform better in a lot of different areas as far as income equity, as far as educational attainment, in a lot of different areas, they just perform better. So there is something to how people are situated and how people are able to access opportunity that impacts the outcomes. So the first outcome, the first key finding, and I guess I will note that of the 3 findings that were statistically significant, all of them had to do with black and white segregation. So lost income was our first key finding, lost lives, and then lost potential. And I'll unpack these a little bit more in the next slides. So when we think about lost income, if we're just looking at reducing our level of black and white segregation just to the national median income, we would expect to see more income for African Americans. So on a one-on-one level, that would look like not quite $3,000 per person. But when we step out, to our region, that's a $4 billion, we're essentially leaving on the table of lost income. And then we also kind of zoom out to what that means for our gross domestic product. That's another $8 billion. So a significant amount of money that it will look very differently in our region if our segregation potentially was lower. How could it look? As far as lost lives, you can't begin to put a price tag on the value of a human life. But when we looked at, particularly in the city of Chicago, who had a really high homicide rate in 2016, that if we brought down our level of segregation, if we were lower at that median point, we could expect to see a 30% lower homicide rate. And that adds up to, in 2016, about 229 lives saved, if you will. And that has direct impacts on lost earning potential of people whose lives have been cut short. It has direct dollar amounts when you think about correction costs and policing costs. And there's also research that shows a strong relationship between real estate values and public safety and homicide rates as well. So lots of money, again, when you think about the economic costs. And then finally, lost potential. So when you look at, educational attainment, so if we were lower in segregation, if we can imagine what it looked like at the median point, we would see 83,000 more people in the Chicago region would have bachelor's degrees. And that's not just for people of color, that's across the board. So educational attainment goes up. And we're missing out on some $90 billion in potential lifetime earnings. There's a significant difference between your potential for earnings when you just have a high school diploma versus when you have a college degree. And so that just really begins to quantify that number that we're missing out on there. So just to give you some perspectives on how we're doing in the nation, and this is looking at 2010, I think, data. But for the most part, Chicago is 5th as far as our regional racial and economic segregation. So it's combined racial, combined economic, and it's the Chicago 7-county region. So these dark orange areas are like the highest segregated areas, and then you have the bluer areas or the lower segregated areas. So places like Philadelphia, Bridgeport, New York, Milwaukee are in that top 5, just to give you some perspective on where we land. So some of our key learnings from phase 1, a couple of things. It was not just another report for us. It actually came out at a time where we were having more conversation about equity and inequity, and the Laquan McDonald shooting was like right in the middle of that. So we were doing this work, but then it was like, there's a time of kind of awakening that we can take advantage of here. we heard people say it's important to acknowledge racism and inequity as the roots of segregation. So make sure you center that in your report. I think one of the other things that we heard is making sure we're framing, equity and inclusion. Like, what does it really take, to move towards equitable outcomes? And then even pushbacks on the positives and negatives segregation. Again, if somebody's not benefiting from segregation, there are other people who are benefiting. So how do we bring that conversation into the fray as well? So in the next phase, we tried to talk about okay, now we know what it's costing us, what do we do about it? So just high level, we spent the year looking at policies that people are employing in other places around the country. We talked to a whole bunch of people. We did surveys. We developed what we thought were good policy practices and interventions, and then we did a roadshow, and we talked to people on the south side, on the west side, in the north suburbs, in the west suburbs, in the south suburbs, just to get a broad perspective. We also did a couple of learning trips. So we went to Seattle, who's been doing a lot of work around in their government around racial equity for about 12 years, in Atlanta, because we saw some really interesting things in their patterns of segregation over the past 20 years to help really subsidize our learning. And then looking forward, when we looked at projections of what could happen in the next several years if we stay on the status quo, the main thing you probably want to take from this is we're starting to see a decline, at least in the city of Chicago, of people of color. And we're starting to see an uptick of people of color moving to the suburban and collar counties. So we're starting to see that migration. Chicago and the region has been losing population, particularly Black population. So even though these were projections at the time we did it, we're starting to see some of the trends of that actually coming true. I just want to talk about a couple of our key recommendations. You can go to our website and dig into them if you really want to geek out on what our recommendations are. But the primary recommendation that we made was, how do we begin to dismantle institutional barriers that kind of hold systematic inequities in place? And it's a challenge for the public sector, the private sector, the civic sector to really do this internal work of looking at where are your internal practices and policies creating inequity, and doing some introspective work to try to fix that. And there's a host of other things that are more focused on tangible things like housing and public safety and education and that as well. But staying in the vein of dismantling institutional and structural racism, I just wanted to highlight just some work that's being done in the region. So Cook County did their strategic planning process in 2018, and they were intentional about centering racial equity as a main priority in their work. So their policy roadmap tries to center that. They've done a lot of internal work around this, and I think in the next couple of months and even the next year, you'll start to see some of the fruits of that work as well. They've been doing also some cross-jurisdictional training in alignment with the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois, hopefully, so that there is a greater impact as we start to see racial equity focused on more from our government structures. And then the city of Evanston, which is something that we're kind of following, is they created a reparations fund that was adopted in 2020. So they're essentially taking, and I see people nodding their heads, so you guys know about this is great. You can probably tell me more. They're taking some of their tax revenue that they're getting from recreational marijuana sales, and they're putting that into a fund for reparations. And I don't think they figured out exactly how that works yet, but they have a committee that's actually looking at that and looking at what should this fund, what kind of programs, potentially things that are related to entrepreneurship and home ownership, education, and infrastructure. Wow. Okay, I was a little concerned because I didn't think I was going to get here in time. So great. I have 3 minutes extra to get you guys ready for the table discussions. Did I go? Oh, I saw this one go first, so I thought I was up here. So now we get to spend the next 60 minutes or so having some discussion. You have great facilitators at each of your table who will guide you through this process. So there are different discussion prompts. We have 3 different prompts. The goal is to get through all of the prompts, and you'll have about 20 minutes to get through each prompt. So facilitators, just raise your hand so we remember who you are. Great. We'll give you kind of a heads up when it's time to shift the topics. And then we'll also have each of the prompts on the screen. But before we jump into our discussion, and the facilitators you guys can do a brief introduction if people don't know each other. If you have questions about my presentation, because I didn't want to take time away from the table discussions, there should be note cards at your table, so you can jot those down. I will pick them up while you guys are talking, and hopefully I can address a few of them before I leave. If not, we'll definitely try to address them through a broader format to get back to some of those questions. Like if there was something you just didn't understand or something you want a clarification on. So before we jump in, I just want to reinforce a couple of the community agreements, which I like to call them, or ground rules for discussion. So one, if we can all agree to this, to listen to understand. So I know that could be hard, but practice active listening, that we, let this be a no judgment zone. The question, I think it's good to ask questions to understand, to understand why, but let's try to suspend our judgment as much as possible to allow people to actually express themselves. And listening without thinking about what you're going to say, but listening to actually hear what the person is saying, I think is really important. Step up and step back. So if you're one of those people who just jump right into the conversation, give yourself maybe some cues, maybe I'll let two people share before I share my thought. And if you're one of those people who sit back and process a lot, like me, I have to process 10 minutes before I say anything, then lean into that conversation, maybe push yourself, maybe give yourself a minute of processing, or maybe process externally to get yourself into the conversation. So our facilitators will do a good job of helping to pull those things out and enforce those. Also, speaking in I statements, let's not, speak for anyone else. We're just here to speak for ourselves. So reflect on your own stories and your own personal experiences. We're not here to speak for any one group. And also just remembering to make room for diverse opinions. So making sure that we are embracing, or at least listening actively to opinions that are different from ours. And again, questioning in a respectful way. So can we all agree to abide by those? Can we raise? Great. Yes, raise your hand. Great. And if there are other things that you think should be on that list, you guys could talk about that at your table. So it is 8 o'clock. I will let you go, and we will reconvene at about 8:45, 8:50, and ask you guys to share a little bit from your conversation before we kind of wrap everything up. Thanks. So you should be moving on to your next discussion prompt. So if you can wrap up your final thoughts and move on to the discussion prompt. 2. Okay, if you're not moving on, you should be wrapping up to get to the last question. I know it feels like it's going by really quickly, but let's try to shift to the third question. Thank you so much for your time, for your sharing, for your honest conversations at the table. I really appreciate you guys having me. I think this is both head work and heart work that we have to do. So everybody's not moved by the moral imperative. Some people are moved by the economic imperative, which was, I think, one of the impetus for us doing the study. But thank you for leaning in this evening with me. And I'll give it back to Pastor Zena to close us out.
Join me in thanking Kendra, please. Do you know who Alexis de Tocqueville is? Yeah. Remember what Alexis said when he found his way to America in the 1700s? He said that you as a nation are built on a foundation of enlightened self-interest. Enlightened self-interest is an ethical position that says, when you get better, I get better. It is a moral philosophy that says, my life and the quality thereof is intimately connected to yours. 1764, I believe. You believe it? Don't answer. I don't want you to lie. I'm serious. I'm serious. Because if you don't believe, if I don't believe that the life of a hungry LGBTQ 19-year-old whose family has thrown them out is not your business, don't answer. If you don't believe that a lost and homeless veteran who is addicted now is not your business, don't answer. De Tocqueville had it right, I think, but it's a moral philosophy and not a way of life. He said, America is great because America is good. When America ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. 350 years ago. Do you believe it? Live it. See you next month.